This story will surprise everyone. On July 16th, 2010, a man was walking with his dogs in the cordon forest in the city of Pico Truncado. He found a young woman lifeless. Joana Casas, aged 20, was well known in the city for having been a beauty queen. The case quickly gained great attention and was solved by the local police, who arrested Joana's ex-boyfriend, Vitor, who, before a jury, was found guilty. But the most shocking thing in this story up until then was that Joana's twin sister Edith married Vitor some time later. That's right, the man convicted of killing her own sister. But this case is more than just that. There's a twist here that will definitely surprise everyone. I'm Marcos Campos, welcome everyone. Here we have new content every week, so if you like real stories, follow us here, turn on the notification bell and leave a comment, even if it's just an emoji, because that really helps our productions. And on other social networks, you can find me as Marcos Campos. Deal? Look, everyone. Honestly, this story is one of the creepiest, strangest, most disturbing that I've ever told for a number of reasons, okay? There's the matter of the investigations, which were rather rushed, to say the least. And the most, bizarre thing in this story is the way the parents of Joana and Edith, who were twins, treated one of them. Everything is very, very dark, surrounding this case, which ended up resulting in the death of an innocent person. Isn't it? As always, a very sad crime story, but with some truly unusual elements. It's Marcos Campos now, so don't get confused. Joana Elizabeth Casas and Edith Joana Casas were born on July 19th, 1990. They were the daughters of Marcelina Orediana and Valentim Casas. Usually, folks, when we see cases like this of siblings, twin sisters who are very similar both physically and in their personalities, they usually wear the same clothes, don't they? Following the same careers, getting the same haircuts, and some even getting married together. Of course, not with the same spouse, but you get what I mean, right? All of this shows that twins have a friendship bond that goes beyond just family ties. They're really close people. But in the case of Joana and Edith, the two were completely different from each other. Not physically, right? In personality, Joana was described as being very outgoing, playful, determined, and always leading the projects that came up. She wasn't shy about speaking in public, made friends very easily, liked to wear very feminine clothes, wore makeup, and cared a lot about her appearance. On the other hand, Edith was introverted. She was shy, quiet, the straightforward type, In quotes, when it came to talking, she got straight to the point. And she also liked to wear more comfortable clothes. She didn't really care about makeup, She preferred to be alone. In this case, instead of the parents accepting that they had two daughters who looked alike physically but had completely different personalities, they, believe it or not, they actually started to spoil Joana and severely criticize even Edith. Joana dreamed of becoming a model, an idea that, of course, was widely supported by her parents. They began investing in their daughter's modeling career. They took Joana to participate in all kinds of beauty contests, including municipal and even state competitions. In some cases, she even left the country to take part in these contests. She even won some competitions multiple times. The most important one was when she became Miss Buenos Aires. And when she returned home to Pico Truncado, which is a province in Santa Cruz, Argentina, she became known by everyone in the region as the Young Miss. Meanwhile, Edith, even though she had the same physical beauty as her sister, refused to take part in events and contests, which made their parents, her parents, right? Sort of, with a slight frown. They would even get furious in some situations, saying that the only daughter who made them proud was Joana. Even with all that, the two sisters got along well. They were close friends and partners in crime until something happened. It was July 16th, 2010, when a dog trainer was out walking, training some of his dogs in an open field area near the cordon forest, about half an hour from downtown Pico Truncado. And During one of the activities, one of the dogs kind of headed toward a spot over there and quickly went over to it. And when the man arrived, he recognized there the remains, the body of a young woman who clearly had 2 gunshot wounds. The authorities identified her, correct? They were called and identified that body as Joana Casas, 20 years old, and her death deeply shook all the local residents. A thorough forensic examination was then carried out at the scene, and everything that was nearby was collected, including a vinyl record and a cigarette butt that was next to the lifeless young woman. But none of this evidence provided a concrete lead, let's say, for the investigation to follow. The cigarette butt was the most valuable item, right? At that moment, it was the most important forensic item, because it could have traces there, biological evidence, and that's why that cigarette butt was sent for analysis. But at the time, it was a very slow test, right? It would have to go through a lot of bureaucratic procedures before the result could be released. That's why the case would be stalled for a long time. However, despite the limited evidence, the investigators continued, right? They kind of relied on the suspicions, and the suspicions, obviously, in cases like this, where a woman's body is found with 2 gunshot wounds, the first suspect was her ex-boyfriend. From the beginning, the investigators believed that the person responsible for that crime was Vitor 27 years old, who was an oil worker and had dated Joana for a year and a half. Between the years 2005 and 2006, the suspicions against Vitor arose because he was known for having a strong personality, let's say. The man sometimes got involved in some fights and arguments and hung out with people involved in the world of crime. What happened then is that a few days later, right, after the investigation started, these suspicions came up. While Vitor was still being investigated for Joana's death, he ended up being arrested after getting involved in a fight. So it kind of created an opportunity, you know? And the police interrogated Vitor about Joana's case, and he presented 3 alibis. A woman who was with him on this supposed night when everything happened at a casino, and also 2 police officers who worked there as casino security, who even talked to Vitor that night. The investigators on the case said they didn't accept the testimony of that woman because they thought she was lying. She had arranged something with Vitor, and the 2 police officers who were there providing security at the casino did not show up to testify. And guys, I'm even going to ask you to write this down in your evidence notebook. Look how fancy this is. There's an evidence notebook here. Keep writing it down because there are a lot of things that we'll need to put together later to draw our conclusions about this story. How did the guy do it with 2 police officers there providing security, even if they were off duty and working a side job? How come they didn't show up to testify? What do you mean? Is that possible in Argentina? I'm not sure. I'll just skip it. But if someone's summoned to give a statement, they have to go, right? It's all very strange. Make a note of that, yeah. So then in this simplistic, oversimplified way, Vitor didn't have, in the view of the police and the investigators, an alibi that really proved anything, right? For the investigation, that he really wasn't at the crime scene when everything happened. So the next step for the investigators was to bring a sniffer dog, actually a few sniffer dogs, to the place where Joana was found. Their goal was to find out if those dogs could sniff, sense anything there with Vitor's scent. In the first 2 times the searches with the dogs were conducted, nobody found anything, nothing was found. But on a 3rd time, they were insisting on it, right? The investigators took the dogs there again, and it said that one of those dogs tracked a scent from Vitor there. That scent went to an area there which was about 3 or 4 meters from where the body had actually been found. The problem is that on this 3rd attempt to prove something, nothing was filmed. There was no evidence that the dog had actually sniffed out Vitor at the crime scene. Besides the word of the police officers themselves, which is certainly something you shouldn't doubt, right? But that was all there was at that moment, and that was enough. It was enough for the case to move forward. The prosecution accepted that Vitor was at the crime scene, and those folks were the only pieces of evidence they had against Vitor. And even so, At his trial, held in early 2011, he was found guilty of murdering Joana Casas, his ex-girlfriend, and he was then sentenced to 13 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. It's clear, as I mentioned at the beginning of the story, that the police were really eager to solve this case quickly. Ex-boyfriend, oh, it must be him, right? That story about the dog supposedly sniffing out Vitor at the crime scene is also at the very least strange, isn't it? Since there were no visual records of the action, only the officer's word was taken into account there. And, as I said, for what reason or reasons would they be questioned, right? Do you think that's all? There's more to the story. Very well. In December 2012, more than 2 years after the crime, all the media outlets in Argentina reported that Edith Casas, Joana's twin sister, was marrying none other than Vitor Kingaloni, the man convicted of her own sister's death. The news was highly publicized and all the newspapers were talking about this event. They said that Edith had a pathological relationship, that she actually wanted to replace her sister, and that she was not psychologically well. After all, how could she fall in love with someone who had taken her sister's life? And in that same vein, Edith's parents went along for them, right? Marcelina and Valentin, that attitude was seen as monstrous, outrageous, and so they started attacking their daughter using the media. Then I asked, right, attack her even more? And reminding you here, the way Edith was treated was always really bizarre, wasn't it? Do you remember that? Now, if she was actually treated like that, we can't say for sure. We're relying on the sources here, but as the more experienced would say, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? On some level of consciousness, maybe even I would say, maybe it really was an act of defiance from Edith against her parents, or did she know something that no one else knew? Valentin, her father, even claimed that Edith was always jealous of her sister, that she was doing this because she wanted to become Joana, and that he believed Edith was actually the mastermind behind his daughter's death plan, that she and Vitor did this to get rid of Joana so they could take her place. Valentin also stated that the only daughter who ever made him proud was Joana, that Joana would be in heaven and that Edith would burn in hell at the right time for her choices and actions. But there's a side note in this story that I need to tell you about. Joana had in fact had a relationship with Vitor back between 2005 and 2006. At the same time, Edith was having a relationship with another man and the four of them would go out together several times. They actually got along well. When Joana ended her relationship with Vitor, Edith kept talking to him. After all, during that year and a half of her sister's relationship with Vitor and Edith's relationship with that other man, they would go out together anyway. They were friends, buddies. But a year after all that, around mid-2007, they realized, that is, Edith and Vitor, that they liked each other. They loved each other and wanted to be together. So Edith went to talk to her sister about what was happening before making any decisions. And Joana simply replied that she was already an adult and could do whatever she thought was best. So Edith started a relationship with Vitor, and after that, Joana began to distance herself from her sister. And as you can probably imagine, this wasn't seen in a good light by their parents. Mainly because it was around that time that they started to think Edith was jealous, and that she only dated Vitor because she wanted to take everything Joana had. She wanted to be her, whatever that twisted idea means. But Edith's relationship with Vitor didn't last long. A year later, in 2008, Vitor broke up with her because, according to reports, he wanted to have other relationships, live life a little more, and didn't want to hurt Edith. After that, they drifted apart. When the crime happened, Edith was no longer speaking to Vitor, but she was present at his trial. And she stated that she was forced by her family to write a letter that was even presented in court, saying that Vitor had raped her, that he had taken Edith to the same place where Joana had been murdered. She also claims that her parents started forcing her to do things she didn't like to make her look and act like Joana. But they weren't satisfied with her, so they started ignoring her. Then, a few years later, she got tired of all that and left her parents' house and went to live with a woman named Claudia, who at the time was her best friend and Vitor's sister. After moving out then, around October or November of 2012, Edith went to visit Vitor for the first time after more than 4 years without speaking to each other. And as soon as they saw each other, they realized they were still in love and ended up getting back together. Edith ended up finding out that during the 2 years Vitor was in prison, he had written several letters to her that were never delivered because her parents received those letters and sent them back, meaning they were returned to the prison. At that moment, they decided that they would get married in December of that same year, and this news shocked everyone, didn't it? Marcelina, the mother, even hired a lawyer to try to stop the marriage, claiming that her daughter was crazy, had mental problems, and was out of her mind. So, by court order, the wedding was suspended until a series of tests could be done to prove that Edith was mentally sane. The exam was conducted in January 2013, which proved that she was perfectly healthy, in impeccable health, and that she had no problems at all, neither psychological, psychiatric, physical, nor anything else. Thus, she was authorized to continue with the marriage. The wedding took place on February 14th, 2013, which is Valentine's Day in Argentina. Did you catch the reference? Only Vitor's family attended. Vitor wore a suit while Edith broke with tradition and got married in a very short red dress. Edith liked to tease a little, but I can't blame her, man. Can you believe how those parents treat them? And here I am telling you about it. I keep making faces of indignation, of surprise, because I already know the whole story, but when you find out, you'll agree with me. Okay, so when they left the notary's office, right? They got married and everything, and the newlyweds were greeted by the public with a shower of stones and eggs, right? The people were stunned by everything that was happening, and they even thought it was the work of the devil. Especially with Edith wearing a red dress there, right? Vitor was still serving his sentence, wasn't he? He left the notary office for the prison while Edith went home. So, contrary to what many media outlets reported, Edith didn't get involved with Vitor only after the crime against her sister. But actually, the two of them had already been in a relationship a long time before. The whole time, from the very beginning, Edith insisted that Vitor was innocent. Edith had even pointed to another man as being responsible, someone she said she was very afraid of when she saw him on the street. But no one believed her, because everyone in society trusted the investigation that had been carried out. And now comes that but, where we get to the plot twist. In early 2012, about 18 months after the crime, a test was conducted on that cigarette butt that had been found at the crime scene. Remember when I mentioned that it was really hard to do this test back then, that it took way too long? In fact, this, in my opinion, is a major misstep in the investigation, right? Putting the cart before the horse, isn't it? Because, you'll see. Anyway, hang on. The cigarette butt was analyzed then, and the test result came out. The investigators were sure that the DNA found on that cigarette butt would be Vitor's. However, everyone was surprised when the DNA result pointed to someone else. A guy named Marcos Diaz, who was Joana's boyfriend at the time of the crime. Do you get it? This guy was Joana's boyfriend when she was killed. But the investigation turned to the ex-boyfriend because he had a history of having a bad temper. You know that story about being convicted on circumstantial evidence and all that? Sometimes that's what happens, but let's see what happened after that. Let's go back a little in time. At the beginning of 2010, Joana had started a relationship with this guy, Marcos Gabriel Diaz, who was 37 years old and had the nickname El Tosco. And shortly after they started dating, she moved in with him. But soon she started complaining to her friends that this guy was kind of jealous. Well, not kind of, right? Very jealous, possessive, and he always threatened her with a firearm. Can you believe that? Those same friends also testified that on the day her life was taken, Joana was with Marcos in his pickup truck. And they had an argument, and all of them were inside the car at the moment Marcos threatened Joana, saying that if she did anything he didn't like again, she would see what would happen. The same witnesses confirmed that the vinyl record that was also found at the crime scene was an album that was in the car that day. Joana had also confessed to these friends that she wanted to end the relationship with this man, but she was afraid because she didn't know how he would react. And look, these witnesses were actually heard at the time of Joanna's death, and Marcos was even arrested. And he assured that he had in fact been with Joana and left her in that place during the night. But then he said he left without doing anything to her. However, since they had no evidence against him, Marcos was released and kind of sidelined in the investigation. Besides that, what also helped the guy get away was Joanna's ex's reputation for having a bad temper. And here, look at the problem the investigation was creating for itself. Marcos and Vitor didn't know each other. And with this DNA test pointing to Marcos, a warrant for his arrest was then issued. But when Marcos found out, he ran away and was on the run for 15 days. And then he voluntarily turned himself in at the police station with a lawyer. It was already July 2013, so 3 years after the crime, Marcos went to trial. And at that trial, faced with the undeniable DNA evidence, let's say, he partially admitted to the crime. He confessed that he was indeed the last one to see Joana, to be with her that day, and that he could have done that to her. The jury, despite that, considered Marcos as the only one guilty of first-degree murder against Joana Casas, and he then received a sentence equivalent to Joana's ex-husband. But now, there was a big legal problem. There were two men convicted and imprisoned individually for the same crime. And it was even suggested that they might have acted together, a conspiracy there to take Joanna's life. But that was soon dismissed, because there was no way to prove it. Also, it didn't make any sense, right? Why would these two join forces to kill the current one's ex? Nothing was presented in this part of the investigation, let's call it part B, that could prove this collusion between these men. The fact is, at that moment, Argentina had created for itself, had in its hands, an anomalous and unprecedented legal case. Anomalous, guys, I'm just using a random term here, okay? Not technical, but that's my view. If they acted together, they'd both be convicted of the same crime. But there was something with B, right? Actually, it was a huge mistake, I think, by the investigation in this whole case. Because think about it. How do you close an inquiry like that? You have the cigarette butt there where there was probably some DNA. It could have been anyone's DNA, right? It was out in the woods, so it could have been, right? A cigarette butt in the middle of an open area in a forest isn't exactly a normal thing. So it's likely that it was actually left there by the killer. There's also the record which belonged to this Marcos guy. He left the record at the crime scene, didn't he? But anyway, in the same month, the defense lawyers for Vitor Cingolani, who was unjustly imprisoned there, let's say, filed an appeal. After all, it was now proven that Marcos was the only one responsible for Joanna's death. Vitor's lawyers then wanted his release, but this appeal was denied and Vitor was once again kept there, also held responsible for Joanna's death. In November that year, the lawyers appealed again, this time to the Supreme Court. And finally, the court understood that there was a major flaw in the investigation and that there was no evidence against Vitor. So, after more than 3 years in prison, Vitor was released and all charges against him were dropped. After gaining his freedom and proving his innocence, Vitor reunited with his family and his wife, Edith. They were the only ones who always understood and supported his innocence. The couple gave several interviews to various television networks and newspapers, telling their story and trying to remove the stigma that had remained over them. In other words, the twin who married the man who took her sister's life. And then they were finally able to be seen as the love story that managed to overcome all obstacles. They ultimately became an example of overcoming adversity. The two avoided mentioning Joana, and over time, Edith's parents tried to reconnect with their daughter. But reconnecting with Valentin, the father, was very difficult because he never got over losing Joana. And all the things he said about Edith too, especially in public, right? All those things caused a general discomfort, a big wound, a big scar in the relationship between father and daughter. But this story isn't over yet, okay? Edith and Vitor's marriage didn't last long because after the public kind of lost interest in the case, things had calmed down, let's say. They ended up having marital problems, in their relationship, and they got divorced about 3 years later. And, according to the latest news about this case, especially about Vitor Cingolani, he would now be around 41 years old. He made news in 2020 as the only person in Pico Truncado to contract COVID. He was hospitalized for a month, discharged, and is now reportedly in a new relationship. Edith is about 34, married, and reportedly had a child in 2021. This news about the arrival of a new family member supposedly brought her parents a bit closer together, but not in the way she would have liked. Marcos Gabriel Diaz, now 51, was convicted in 2013 for Joana's death. He is still being held at the local prison in Pico Truncado and is expected to be released, possibly due to some kind of benefit, in 2026. At least that's what the sources say. What a case, right? These actions are kind of sick, aren't they? Everything is actually kind of sick, isn't it, in the relationship between Edith's parents and her. Even while Joana was alive, there was always the issue of treating the two daughters differently. Something that certainly must have caused some... maybe just a small level there, right? Each person is unique in their perceptions. But Edith must have been shaken, you know, with many scars. If she acted on impulse there, marrying Vitor, I don't know. Probably not. Maybe they really liked each other even though the relationship ended. But anyway, I wanted to know your opinion about these details of the case. What kind of investigation was that, right? What kind of anxiety was that? And most importantly, guys, tell me in the comments, would you forgive your parents if they did this to you? Well, that was today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for keeping me company. A kiss from Ruivo, and see you in the next episode.